Alexander Moretti was a man who thrived on control. Every aspect of his life, from his multimillion-dollar business empire to the meticulously maintained routines of his household, was governed by precision. He was a man who believed that discipline and structure were the foundations of success, and he ensured that his son, Ethan, lived by the same principles. Their estate, a sprawling mansion in upstate New York, stood as a testament to Alexander's achievements. With its grand pillars, expansive gardens, and towering glass windows, it was more than just a home, it was a fortress, a symbol of stability and order. Yet, within its vast walls, something vital had been missing for a long time. Ethan, at 12 years old, was a quiet, introspective child. He had not always been this way. There was a time when he laughed freely, when his eyes sparkled with curiosity and excitement. But after his mother's passing 3 years ago, a shadow had settled over him. He withdrew into himself, finding solace in books and routines rather than in the carefree joys of childhood. His world had become predictable, measured, and silent, just the way his father preferred it. Into this rigid household entered Camila, the new cook. A woman of about 30, with sharp eyes and a quiet presence. She had been hired 6 months ago, and, like every other employee in the Moretti household, she had gone largely unnoticed by Alexander. She did her job well, meals were prepared on time, the kitchen remained spotless, and she never overstepped her role. But Alexander had failed to notice something crucial. Ethan had noticed her. Unlike the other employees, Camila did not treat the boy as merely the son of a wealthy businessman. She spoke to him with warmth, asked him questions about his interests, and most importantly, she listened. It was during one of these quiet conversations that she discovered his secret longing. Ethan wanted to dance. Of course, he had never voiced this to his father. Dance had no place in the Moretti household. It was not practical, it was not disciplined, and most of all, it did not fit into the carefully curated life Alexander had designed for his son. But Camila understood something Alexander did not. Ethan wasn't looking for rebellion. He was looking for freedom. And so, one afternoon, as Alexander walked past the large glass windows that overlooked the garden, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Ethan was dancing. It wasn't just the sight of his son moving across the lawn that stunned him, it was who he was dancing with. There, guiding Ethan with measured precision, was Camila. Her movements were not casual or improvised, they were deliberate, practiced, professional. Something about the scene unsettled Alexander in a way he could not quite define. A deep unease crept through him. He had built his world on certainty, on knowing everything that happened in his home, in his business, in his life. And yet, as he stood there watching, he realized something chilling. There was a secret unfolding right under his own roof. And he had no idea what it was. Alexander Moretti prided himself on knowing everything that happened under his roof. His estate, with its towering marble columns and sprawling acres of manicured gardens, operated like a well-oiled machine. There was no room for surprises, no space for chaos. And yet, as he stood by the window, staring into the late afternoon sun, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Outside, on the neatly trimmed lawn, Ethan was dancing. It took Alexander a moment to fully register what he was seeing. His 12-year-old son, usually reserved and bookish, was moving across the grass with an energy he hadn't displayed in years. His steps were hesitant, unsure, but there was something else, a lightness, a joy. He wasn't alone. Camila, the cook, was with him. She wasn't merely indulging a child's whim. She was leading him, guiding him, her own movements fluid and precise. There was a discipline to her steps, an unmistakable grace that spoke of years of training. She wasn't just a woman teaching a boy how to move, she was a dancer. Alexander felt a strange sensation rise in his chest, something between irritation and disbelief. Who was this woman to step beyond her role, to influence his son in ways he hadn't foreseen? With measured steps, he strode out onto the stone pathway, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the surface. As he approached, Ethan faltered mid-step, his expression shifting from excitement to apprehension. Camila, however, remained composed. She straightened her posture, wiped her hands on her apron, and met Alexander's gaze with quiet confidence. "What is going on here?" Alexander's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Ethan lowered his eyes. "We were just practicing," he mumbled. Alexander's gaze flicked to Camila. "Practicing what, exactly?" "Your son wants to learn how to dance," she said simply. Alexander's jaw tightened. He turned to Ethan. "Since when?" The boy hesitated, his hands curling into small fists at his sides. "For a while now." A pang of something unfamiliar struck Alexander's chest. Guilt? No, that wasn't possible. He had given Ethan everything a child could need: security, education, a future. Hadn't he? "And why didn't you tell me?" His tone was softer now, though he hadn't meant it to be. Ethan shrugged, but before he could speak, Camila answered for him. Because he had no one to practice with. There was something about the way she said it, firm, unwavering, that irritated Alexander more than he cared to admit. "This isn't your job," he stated. "No, it isn't," Camila agreed. "Then why are you doing it?" She held his gaze. "Because he asked me to." A heavy silence settled between them. Alexander exhaled slowly, his irritation simmering beneath the surface. There was something more to this situation, something hidden beneath the surface. And he wasn't the kind of man to leave questions unanswered. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice quieter now. "Alone." Ethan looked between them, his brow furrowed with concern. Camila, however, simply nodded. "As you wish, Mr. Moretti." As Alexander turned and walked back toward the house, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. Ethan leaned toward Camila, whispering something, and she responded with a quiet, unreadable smile. A chill ran through Alexander. Something was happening right under his nose. And he was determined to uncover the truth. Alexander Moretti was not a man who liked mysteries. In business, he had built his empire by knowing everything there was to know about his competitors, his employees, his investments. Control was his currency, and uncertainty was an unacceptable risk. And now, under his own roof, something was happening that he did not understand. Camila. She was just a cook, or at least, that's what she was supposed to be. Yet, what he had seen in the garden told a different story. Her movements were not those of an amateur, not the product of casual interest. They were refined, disciplined, purposeful. He had spent enough time around powerful people to recognize mastery when he saw it. And Camila was more than just a woman teaching a boy how to dance, she was a professional. Sitting in the dim glow of his study that evening, Alexander leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. His computer screen cast a pale blue light across the room as he began his search. Camila Alvarez. He typed her name into a background check database, a tool he often used when vetting business associates. The results appeared in seconds. Age, 29. Employment, hired as a cook 6 months ago. Criminal record, none. Education, no notable records. Nothing suspicious. Nothing unusual. Just a woman with an unremarkable past. But Alexander knew better. He refined his search, adding a keyword that had been nagging at him ever since he had seen her dance. Camila Alvarez ballerina. At first, nothing. Then, buried beneath articles and old websites, he found it. A news article from 7 years ago. Alexander clicked on the link, and as the page loaded, a photograph of a much younger Camila filled the screen. She was dressed in a pristine white ballet costume, poised in an elegant arabesque on a grand stage. Her expression was serene, confident, nothing like the reserved woman who worked in his kitchen. The headline sent a chill through him. Rising ballet star disappears from the spotlight, no explanation given. His pulse quickened as he read. The article spoke of a young prodigy, a dancer with unparalleled grace and technique. Camila had been on the cusp of international fame, performing in prestigious theaters across the country. Critics had called her a once-in-a-generation talent. She had been offered a place in a world-renowned ballet company. And then, she vanished. No scandal. No injury. No farewell performance. She had simply walked away. Alexander sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Why would someone with that kind of talent abandon their future? And how had she ended up here, cooking in his house? His instincts told him there was more to the story. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by staring at a computer screen. Rising from his chair, he strode out of his office and down the hall toward the kitchen. He found Camila standing at the counter, methodically chopping vegetables. She glanced up as he entered, her expression neutral but guarded. "Mr. Moretti," she greeted him calmly. "Is there something you need?" Alexander didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the counter, the article displayed on the screen. "Care to explain this?" For the first time since he had met her, he saw a flicker of genuine surprise cross her face. It was brief, but it was there. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked at the screen, then back at him. "You've been searching for me," she said, her voice measured. "I don't like mysteries in my home," Alexander replied. Camila exhaled slowly, setting down the knife. For a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. But then, after a long pause, she spoke. "I suppose I should have expected this," she said quietly. "You're not the type of man to leave questions unanswered." Alexander said nothing. He only waited. She glanced at the article again, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter. "I was a dancer," she admitted. "A long time ago." "You were more than just a dancer," Alexander corrected. "You were a star." A bitter smile touched her lips. A star that burned out before it could shine. He studied her carefully. "Why did you leave?" She hesitated. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she weighed whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she sighed. "Because I lost everything." Her voice was quieter now, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it before. Alexander said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "When I was 22, dance was my entire world," she said. "It was all I knew, all I cared about. I trained endlessly, pushing myself beyond limits because I believed I was meant for something greater." She paused, then added, "And I wasn't alone." Alexander frowned. "Who?" She swallowed hard. "My fiancé. Adrian. He was a dancer too. We had trained together since we were children. We were supposed to take on the world together." Alexander felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He already knew where this was going. "The day before our biggest performance, Adrian was hit by a car," she continued, her eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. "He died instantly." Silence stretched between them. After that, I couldn't dance, she admitted. I couldn't even hear music without feeling like a part of me had been ripped away. Everything I had built my life around was gone. She looked at him then, her gaze steady. So I disappeared. Alexander let her words sink in. He had expected something tragic, but not this. So you became a cook, he said, not unkindly. Camila let out a quiet breath. I needed something far removed from dance. Something practical. Something safe. Alexander exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. And now, he asked. Camila's lips pressed together before she answered. Now, I teach your son. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He knew she didn't mean it as a challenge, but it felt like one. She had walked away from dance. Yet, for some reason, she had chosen to share it with Ethan. Why? What made her decide to break her own rule for his son? Ethan sat at the long mahogany dining table, his fingers tracing absent-minded patterns on the linen tablecloth. The chandelier above cast a soft golden glow, but the room felt heavy with unspoken words. Across from him, Alexander Moretti sipped his evening espresso, flipping through financial reports as if nothing were amiss. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Dad, he said, his voice steady but quiet. Alexander didn't look up. I want to enter a dance competition. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Alexander's fingers paused mid-page, and for a moment, he simply sat there, unmoving. Slowly, he set his espresso cup down, folded his hands, and met his son's gaze. A dance competition, he repeated, as if testing the words. Ethan nodded. Yes. There's a regional competition in 2 months. I want to compete. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying him. His expression was unreadable, but Ethan could feel the weight of his father's scrutiny. When did you decide this? Ethan hesitated, but only for a second. A while ago. Camila thinks I'm ready. At the mention of her name, Alexander's expression darkened. Does she? Yes, Ethan said firmly. And I believe I am too. A muscle in Alexander's jaw tightened. He glanced at his son, really looked at him. There was something in Ethan's eyes, something unfamiliar. Determination. Alexander exhaled, setting his elbows on the table. Ethan, competitions aren't about fun. They require discipline, pressure, and expectation. Are you ready for that? Ethan sat up straighter. I know. And I'm ready. Alexander studied him for a long moment, then finally, he sighed. Fine. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? If you're going to do this, you do it properly, Alexander said. No half measures. If you commit fully. Ethan broke into a grin so wide that it stunned Alexander for a moment. Thank you, Dad. That night, Ethan could barely contain his excitement. He rushed to the kitchen, where Camila was wiping down the counters. She looked up as he entered, breathless and beaming. He said yes. Ethan blurted out. Camila raised an eyebrow. Really? Ethan nodded. But on one condition, he wants me to take it seriously. Camila smirked. Well, that was the plan all along. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing in the grand ballroom of the Moretti estate, its polished floors gleaming beneath the morning light. Camila stood before him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You want to compete? She asked. Yes. Then I'm not going easy on you, she warned. If you think I'm just going to teach you a few steps and send you on your way, you're mistaken. Ethan straightened his shoulders. "I don't want it to be easy." Camila gave a small, approving nod. "Good. Then let's begin." For the next 2 hours, Ethan moved through drills, posture, footwork, turns, balance. Camila corrected him relentlessly, her voice sharp but never unkind. Again, she commanded after a misstep. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow and started over. From the doorway, Alexander watched in silence. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable, but something inside him stirred. Ethan was different. He wasn't the timid boy who used to disappear behind books. He was pushing himself, refusing to give up. As the days passed, the training intensified. Camila worked Ethan harder than ever, but he never complained. He trained late into the evening, repeating routines over and over. One night, as he sat at the dining table, Ethan barely touched his food. Alexander noticed the way his son's leg bounced under the table, his fingers twitching. "What's on your mind?" Alexander asked. Ethan hesitated. "There's another dancer in the competition. His name is Nicholas Beltran." Alexander nodded. "And?" Ethan bit his lip. "He's won 2 years in a row. He messaged me, said I don't stand a chance." Alexander's fingers tightened around his glass. "And what do you think?" Ethan hesitated before admitting, "I don't know." Alexander leaned forward. "Listen to me, Ethan. People only try to break you down when they see you as a threat. If Nicholas is going out of his way to talk to you, it means he's already worried." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. His posture shifted. "You really think so?" Alexander nodded. "I know so." A slow smile crept onto Ethan's face. "Then I guess I'll just have to prove him wrong." Alexander exhaled, watching his son with something close to admiration. For the first time in years, he saw fire in Ethan's eyes. And for the first time, he wanted to see where it would take him. Alexander Moretti sat alone in his study, the amber glow of the fireplace flickering against the mahogany bookshelves. In his hand, he cradled a glass of bourbon, the rich aroma filling the room. He swirled the liquid absently, his mind elsewhere, on his son, on Camila, on everything that had unfolded in the past few weeks. Ethan was changing. At first, Alexander had dismissed the boy's interest in dance as a fleeting distraction, something that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. But that wasn't what had happened. Ethan had thrown himself into training with a determination Alexander hadn't seen before. He was focused, driven, not just playing around, but working. And that should have pleased him. After all, Alexander had always believed in discipline and commitment. Yet, this was different. This was dance. A memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. He was 17 again, sitting at a polished upright piano in his childhood home. His fingers moved fluidly over the keys, the melody filling the room. Music had been his first love, his escape from the rigid world his father had built around him. But it hadn't lasted. The day he had told his father he wanted to study music, he had been met with cold, unwavering disapproval. "A real man builds something solid, Alexander," his father had said. "Music is a hobby, not a future." That was the last time he had played. Now, as he stared into the fire, he realized something unsettling. He had spent his life ensuring that Ethan never lacked for anything: education, security, structure. But had he, in his own way, done the same thing his father had done to him? Had he given his son everything except the freedom to truly be himself? A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Camila. She stepped inside, her posture as poised as always, But there was something in her eyes, an understanding, perhaps, as if she knew exactly what was going through his mind. "You don't like losing control," she said softly. Alexander exhaled, setting his glass down. "I like knowing what's best for my son." "Do you?" Camila tilted her head. "Because from where I stand, he's the one who finally knows what's best for himself." Alexander frowned. "You think I've held him back?" "I think you've protected him," she corrected. "But sometimes, protecting someone means letting them take risks. Letting them fall." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "And if he fails?" Camila gave him a knowing look. "Then he learns. And he gets back up." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was the one teaching Ethan how to be strong, or if Ethan was teaching him. The theater buzzed with nervous energy. Backstage, dancers stretched, coaches whispered last-minute advice, and the air was thick with anticipation. The polished wooden floor of the stage gleamed under the bright overhead lights, waiting for the next competitor to take their place. Ethan stood among them, adjusting the straps of his dance shoes. His hands trembled slightly, and his heart pounded against his ribs. He had trained for this moment for weeks, pushing himself harder than he ever thought possible. But now, standing in the wings, the reality of the competition settled over him. He wasn't just here to dance. He was here to prove something, to himself, to his father, to everyone who had ever doubted him. A firm hand landed on his shoulder. "Camila." "Breathe," she said simply. Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding. "You've done the work," she continued. "The only thing left to do is dance." Ethan swallowed hard, glancing toward the audience. In the front row sat his father, Alexander Moretti, dressed in his usual sharp suit. But his expression was different tonight, less guarded, less distant. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation of perfection. Just something steady. Something real. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Next, we welcome Ethan Moretti to the stage." Ethan's stomach flipped, but he squared his shoulders. This was it. As he stepped onto the stage, the lights were blinding, the silence pressing against him like a weight. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. What if he failed? What if he forgot the steps? What if Nicholas Beltran had been right? Then the music began. And Ethan let go. His body moved before his mind could second-guess itself. The first step was precise, the second even smoother. He let the rhythm take over, every movement flowing into the next. The stage became his world. The pressure melted away. For the first time, he wasn't dancing to win. He was dancing because it felt like flying. The final sequence was the most difficult, a spin and leap that had given him trouble for weeks. He braced himself, pushed off the floor, and for a split second, time seemed to slow. Then he landed. Light on his feet. Steady. The music stopped. Silence. Then, the applause erupted. Ethan stood there, his chest rising and falling, his skin damp with sweat. He scanned the crowd, searching. His father was on his feet, clapping. Camila too, her eyes shining with pride. The results were announced soon after. And the winner of this year's competition is Nicholas Beltran. The audience cheered as Nicholas stepped forward, his confident smirk never wavering. Ethan swallowed hard, keeping his expression neutral. He had lost. But before he could process the disappointment, the announcer continued. "We would also like to present a special award for artistic expression, one that recognizes not just technical skill, but passion, connection, and heart. This award goes to Ethan Moretti. The crowd erupted again. Ethan blinked in surprise as his name echoed through the theater. He stepped forward, accepting the medal placed around his neck. It wasn't the first place trophy. But as he turned toward the audience, his father's expression told him everything he needed to know. Later, as he removed his dance shoes in the dressing room, Nicholas approached him. "Not bad," Nicholas said, twirling his trophy in his hands. "You might actually be decent next year." Ethan smirked. "Next year, I'm winning." Nicholas chuckled. "We'll see about that." Outside the theater, Alexander and Camila waited. When Ethan finally emerged, his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "How do you feel?" Ethan thought for a moment, then answered honestly. "Proud." Alexander nodded. "Good." As they walked toward the car, Ethan glanced down at the medal in his hands. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about proving to himself that he belonged on that stage. And next time, he'd be even better. The car ride home was quiet, but it was not the heavy silence that had once filled the Moretti estate. This time, it was a peaceful quiet, a silence of understanding. Ethan sat in the back seat, his fingers tracing the edge of his medal, turning it over again and again. He wasn't looking at it with disappointment. He was thinking, planning, already imagining what he would do better next time. Alexander glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He had seen a change in his son, not just in the way he moved, but in the way he carried himself. Ethan was no longer the quiet, hesitant boy who shrank into the background. He was confident now, sure of himself in a way Alexander had never been at his age. The realization unsettled him. When they arrived home, Ethan stretched and yawned. "Good night, Dad." Alexander hesitated. "Ethan." His son paused at the bottom of the staircase. Alexander cleared his throat. "I'm proud of you." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but then he smiled, really smiled. "Thanks, Dad." As Ethan disappeared upstairs, Alexander remained standing in the dimly lit hallway, the weight of the moment pressing on him. It was such a small thing, telling his son he was proud. And yet, he realized with a sharp pang that he had never said it before. Not once. A new beginning. The next morning, Alexander found Camila in the kitchen, carefully chopping herbs. She looked up as he entered, setting the knife down as if she had been expecting him. "You knew he would ask me," he said. Camila smirked. "I suspected." Alexander exhaled, leaning against the counter. "You think he has real talent?" She wiped her hands on a towel, considering the question. "I think talent only matters if you have passion." Alexander nodded slowly. "And you think he has that?" Camila's expression softened. "I know he does." A long pause settled between them. Finally, Alexander spoke. "He wants to keep training." Camila tilted her head. "And what do you want?" Alexander hesitated. What did he want? He had spent his life building something solid, something controlled. He had thought that was enough, that security and success would guarantee happiness. But Ethan had shown him something else. He had spent years ensuring his son had everything he needed, except, perhaps, the one thing that mattered most. Freedom. Alexander let out a slow breath. "I want him to be happy." Camila smiled, the kind of smile that said she had known the answer before he did. "Then let's get to work," she said. Alexander nodded. For the first time in years, he wasn't just making decisions based on logic or control. He was making one based on love, and nothing would ever be the same again. Life is a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. For Alexander Moretti, the greatest revelation was not about business or control, but about love, passion, and the courage to let go. His journey reminds us that true success is not measured in wealth or achievements, but in the happiness and fulfillment of those we love. As we grow older, it's easy to hold on to what feels safe and predictable. We build walls of discipline and routine, believing they will protect us. But in doing so, we sometimes forget the importance of joy, of allowing ourselves and others the freedom to pursue what truly makes life meaningful. Ethan's passion for dance became a bridge between a father and son who had drifted apart. It took vulnerability for Alexander to open his heart, to see beyond his own expectations, and to support his son's dreams. This story is a reminder that it is never too late to change, to listen, and to embrace the unexpected. Whether in parenting, relationships, or personal growth, the greatest gift we can give is the freedom to be ourselves, and the courage to let others do the same.